They went out for a walk and never came back. After 18 years, the terrible truth shocked everyone. Subscribe and write in the comments from where you're watching this video. The rhythmic hum of fluorescent lights above and the sharp scent of disinfectant filled the narrow hallway of St. Francis Clinic, nestled between two crumbling buildings in the southern stretch of Baton Rouge. Leanna James moved briskly down the corridor, her soft-soled shoes nearly silent against the scuffed linoleum floors. Clipped to her waistband was the patient chart for room 204, but her mind was elsewhere, floating between memories she rarely allowed herself to touch. She tucked a stray lock of hair back under her nurse's cap and forced a professional smile as she pushed open the door. Inside, Mrs. Jernigan, a frail woman in her 80s with clouded eyes and a sharp tongue, complained about her bland lunch. Leanna gently adjusted the woman's pillows, checked her IV, and nodded through the litany of grievances, offering soft words in response. It was easier to listen than to speak, easier to focus on bedpans and vitals than let her mind wander to the space inside her that still bled. It had been 18 years. 18 years since the bright Sunday morning that shattered her world. 18 years since the last time she had seen her baby sisters, Naomi and Nora, playing in the backyard in their matching yellow dresses, giggling as they chased each other through the grass. Leanna could still see it, still hear it. The slow turn of her mother's head when she realized the back gate was open, the rising panic in her voice, the desperate calls for help, the way time had crawled and then sprinted and then collapsed into silence. She finished with Mrs. Jernigan and stepped into the break room, pouring herself a lukewarm cup of coffee from a pot that had likely been sitting for hours. She took a sip, wincing at the bitterness. Around her, the staff chatted about mundane things, the weather, a sale at the corner store, someone's cousin getting married again. Leanna nodded when spoken to, but offered little in return. She didn't have the energy for small talk. The only photo she kept at work was taped inside her locker. A faded picture of 3 girls on a porch swing, her in the middle, grinning with a missing front tooth, Naomi on her left with braids undone, Nora on her right clutching a stuffed dog. They had been inseparable. Sisters, but also a unit. And then, one day, they were gone. The official story was as senseless as it was empty. No signs of forced entry, no credible witnesses, no ransom demand. There had been whispers in the community, accusations, murmurs of a mother unfit to raise her children, of a father who had turned his back. The police had come and gone, their visits growing less frequent. The news moved on. The world kept spinning. Leanna never did. She had grown up in the shadow of that loss, navigating her teenage years like a ghost. Her mother, Devora, spiraled into grief, walking the streets at night barefoot, calling out the girls' names to the wind. She died 2 years later from what the doctor labeled a stroke, but what Leanna knew was heartbreak. Her father, Robert, disappeared shortly after. One day he simply didn't come home. No note, no word, just another absence to live with. Raised by her Aunt Clarice, Leanna learned to bury her grief under layers of silence. She finished high school, got her nurse's aide certification, had 3 children with a man who didn't stick around long enough to learn their middle names. Her life was defined by resilience, but her heart remained tethered to a moment she could never forget. It was nearly 5 o'clock when the 2 women walked into the clinic. Leanna didn't notice them at first, focused as she was on logging patient charts, but the sound of their laughter, light, melodic, familiar, caught her attention. She glanced up. They were both white, early 20s, dressed in business casual slacks and sweaters. One had curls pulled into a high ponytail, The other wore glasses and a long beige coat. They looked out of place here, like they belonged to another part of town entirely. But there was something in the way the one with the glasses tilted her head when she laughed, in the way her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve. Leanna's breath caught. She watched from across the waiting room as they spoke to the receptionist. One of them handed over an ID card. The receptionist nodded, typing something into the computer. When the woman turned slightly, Leanna caught a glimpse of the name on the card. Noel Harper. Noel. Her skin prickled. That name. It couldn't be a coincidence. Naomi's favorite toy as a child had been a ragged plush lamb she named Noel. She carried it everywhere, even tucked it into her backpack on the last day Leanna saw her. Her stomach twisted. The women took seats near the window, engrossed in conversation. Leanna couldn't hear what they were saying, but she couldn't look away. There was something about the shape of their faces, their voices, the rhythm of their words. It was like hearing music from a dream she once had, a tune that once meant home. She forced herself to turn back to her desk, hands shaking. She didn't believe in signs. Not anymore. But this felt like something. She reached into her bag and pulled out her notebook, scribbling down the name. Noel Harper. She added the date, time, and clinic visit number. That night, after putting her children to bed and making sure the dishes were done, Leanna retrieved an old photo album from the back of her closet. It was wrapped in a stained dish towel and smelled faintly of cedar. She hadn't opened it in years. Turning the pages, she found the image she remembered. The three of them on the porch swing. She studied Naomi's face, the dimple in her right cheek, the way her front teeth overlapped slightly. She flipped to another photo. Naomi and Nora at a birthday party, both with ribbons in their hair. She stared for a long time, heart pounding. Then she pulled out her phone and looked up Noel Harper on social media. It didn't take long to find her. The profile was public. There she was, the same woman from the clinic, smiling in front of a university banner. Human rights fellow, activist, adopted and blessed. Leanna's breath caught again. Adopted. She clicked through the pictures. In some, Noel stood beside another young woman. Same age, similar features. They weren't identical, but they had the kind of resemblance that only came from shared history. In one post, they called each other sisters by choice, not by blood. But Leanna knew. She knew. These were not coincidences. These were her sisters. Tears burned in her eyes, but she didn't cry. She couldn't. Not yet. Her mind was already racing ahead. There were questions to ask, paths to follow, people to confront. But all of that would come later. For now, she stared at the screen, whispering their names. Naomi. Nora. She reached up and touched the photo on her screen. I found you. The morning after her discovery, Leanna woke before dawn, her body stiff from a restless night and her mind thick with fragments of dreams. Some had been warm, memories of the girls as they used to be, dancing in the backyard with ribbons tied around their wrists. Others were darker, voices calling from behind locked doors, crying for someone who never came. She sat up in bed, slowly, staring out the small bedroom window at the bruised sky. The city was still quiet, the streets wet from a light rain that had fallen during the night. In the other room, her children still slept, their breaths even and soft through the thin walls. For a moment, she watched them, feeling both grateful and helpless. How could she protect them from a world that had stolen her own blood right out from under her feet? After making coffee, She sat at the kitchen table with her phone and the small spiral-bound notebook she always carried. She wrote the names again. Noel Harper, Abigail Stone. The second name she had found by digging deeper into Noel's profile. Her sister's frequent companion in photos, tagged in posts as my other half or my soul twin. The resemblance between Abigail and the girl Leanna remembered as Nora had become impossible to ignore. The shape of the eyes, the tilt of the smile, even the curve of her shoulders, familiar in an ache-born way. Leanna had compared their faces to the photographs in her family album until her hands trembled. But resemblance wasn't proof. She needed more. She searched for every reference to the women she could find. Online articles, nonprofit websites, academic interviews. She learned they had both been adopted as children. Together, at age 6, according to one university press piece, adopted by a white Christian family in Georgia. Their story was often told as a kind of feel-good miracle. 2 little girls saved from an unstable home, given a second chance by God's grace through a program affiliated with the New Heart Evangelical Mission. The words hit her like broken glass. She knew that name. New Heart Evangelical. Her mother had taken them to that church when they were children. Every Sunday, Devorah would dress them in their best, press ribbons into their hair, and walk them the 5 blocks to service. The church had been a pillar in the community, or so everyone believed. It offered food drives, after-school programs, counseling sessions. But beneath its generous exterior, Leanna remembered unease. The way the white pastor, Reverend Simmons, smiled a little too tightly when he spoke to her mother. The way certain women in the congregation seemed to watch their every move. How one day, after Sunday service, the girls were invited to special playtime with a volunteer, something Devorah had not agreed to but had not been told until later. Leanna's mother had raised hell about it. She remembered the shouting, the fury in her mother's voice when she came home with both girls and told her husband, Robert, that they would never go back. That something about that place was wrong. And yet, weeks later, Naomi and Nora were gone. Now, sitting at her table, Leanna's hands trembled as she pieced together the unspoken. That church had not only taken her sisters' lives, but rewritten them entirely. And the world had clapped, praised, called it salvation. She pushed back from the table and stood, breath uneven, fury simmering beneath her ribs. She had to know how deep it went. And she needed help. Later that afternoon, she visited the public library downtown, a place she hadn't set foot in since high school. The air inside was still and cool, the scent of aged pages and floor wax thick in the air. She made her way to the microfilm room, where old newspapers and public records were stored. The librarian, a woman with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, pointed her to a small cubicle with a cranky machine and a pile of rolls. For hours, Leanna sat hunched over the glowing screen, scrolling through yellowed pages from 18 years ago. Local headlines, obituaries, church announcements. Finally, she found it. A modest article titled, New Heart Expands Outreach Program to At-Risk Families. The piece described a new initiative, the Second Chance Family Fellowship, designed to rescue children from cycles of poverty, addiction, and neglect. The article praised the early success of the program and mentioned that it had already placed 4 children with carefully screened homes in neighboring states. The word placed made her stomach turn. She wrote down the names mentioned, directors, donors, pastors, and moved on. The further she dug, the more disturbing the language became. Terms like reclamation, moral reparenting, and spiritual rehabilitation were used to justify taking children from families deemed unfit by church standards. And those standards were always subjective, always coded. The next day, she returned to the clinic and moved through her shift like a shadow. Her thoughts were fixed on the connection, the bridge between then and now. That night, after putting the children to bed, she returned to her notes. She drew a line between New Heart Evangelical and the names she now carried in her soul: Naomi, Nora, Noel, Abigail. And then she remembered something else, something from the final weeks before the girls vanished. Her mother had once said, voice low and frightened, that someone had come by the house asking about the twins. A woman from the church, she'd said she worked with the fellowship program, said she had concerns about the girls' safety and offered help. Devora had slammed the door in her face. Leanna had nearly forgotten that moment, tucked into the folds of childhood like a bad dream. But now it flared to life, vivid and sickening. She picked up her phone and made a call to the parish archives office. She needed church records, donation logs, event calendars, anything that might trace the movements of the people involved. The woman on the line was polite until Leanna mentioned the program. Then her tone shifted. "I'm sorry," she said curtly. "Those records are sealed. Private church property." "Sealed by who?" Leanna asked. "By request of the Foundation's legal counsel." Leanna's pulse pounded. "I have reason to believe my sisters were a part of that program, that they were taken. I'm sorry, ma'am. I can't help you." The line went dead. She sat there, staring at the blank wall, fury mounting. Someone had locked the truth away, hidden it beneath bureaucracy and holy language. She was not going to let them. The next day, she received a call from an unknown number. A man's voice, calm but cold, spoke on the other end. "You've been asking questions," he said, "digging where you shouldn't. Who is this?" "A concerned party. Let the past rest, Miss James, for your sake and for your children's." The line went dead before she could respond. She stood still for a long time, the phone clenched in her hand. The silence around her pulsed. Fear twisted in her gut, but beneath it was something stronger, older. It rose like a tide and burned behind her eyes. They wanted her silent. They'd taken her sisters, erased their names, called it God's will. They'd covered it in charity and scripture, wrapped it in adoption papers and good intentions. But now she was awake. She turned to her notebook and wrote a single line in bold, slanted handwriting. Find New Heart. Find who signed the papers. Find who took them. She underlined it twice. Then she opened her laptop and began searching for someone who could help. A reporter. A lawyer. A name from the past. And then she remembered something else. Something even more startling. Her father had warned her. The last time she saw Robert James, he stood in the front yard, suitcase in one hand, eyes tired and hollow. She'd been just 15. He kissed her forehead, whispered, "If I don't come back, find the truth." And then he vanished. She had thought he abandoned them. Now, a new question bloomed in her chest. What if he hadn't? What if he had been looking all along? The air was thick with August heat, and the old church clock struck 4 as Leanna stood outside the courthouse annex in the heart of downtown Baton Rouge. The sun pressed against her back like a weight, but she hardly noticed. Her heart was thudding, steady and loud, as she stared across the plaza at the small government building where city records were kept. She had spent the last 2 days chasing dead ends. Emails that bounced, calls that were never returned, names that led nowhere. Her search for information about New Heart Evangelical's Second Chance Family Fellowship had been met with locked doors, sudden silences, and veiled threats. And then came the message. She had received it by text the night before from a number that left no trace. A short, cryptic message. Check the courthouse, basement level, file room. She didn't know who had sent it or why they'd risk doing so, but something inside her had shifted when she read it. A flicker of hope, or maybe desperation. Something that propelled her here, standing now with sweat beading at her temple, her hands curled into fists at her sides. Inside, the cool air slapped her skin as she passed through security, her nurse's ID clipped to her shirt in case anyone asked why she was here. She moved with quiet purpose down the hall, past worn bulletin boards and rows of plastic chairs, until she reached the stairwell. The basement was dim and smelled faintly of mildew and old paper. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she descended. The file room sat behind a glass window with a metal counter and a bored-looking clerk who glanced up at her without much interest. Leanna approached, trying to keep her voice even. "I'm looking for court adoption records," she said, "from about 18 years ago, for children transferred through private faith-based organizations." The man raised a brow. "Those records are sealed, especially if it involves private adoption agencies." "I know. I just need to know if the name Robert James appears anywhere in the system from that year." He hesitated, then typed something into the computer. His eyes flicked to the screen, then back to her. "Nothing sealed under that name." "What about aliases?" she asked. "Can you check for employment records in the building under maintenance or janitorial staff?" He sighed, clearly unmotivated, but began typing again. After a few moments, his eyebrows lifted slightly. Robert J. Thomas. Hired 17 years ago. Maintenance team. Currently active. Assigned to this building. Leanna's breath caught. "Where is he now?" "Usually works nights. Starts at 6 p.m. You just missed him yesterday. Break room's down that hall. He'll be there when he clocks in." She thanked him and stepped away, the world narrowing around her as she walked down the hallway. Her legs felt unsteady beneath her. It couldn't be. After all these years, he was alive? And here? Working beneath the very roof where she stood, she waited outside the break room, unsure of what to expect. The idea that he might not recognize her, or worse, might not want to, clawed at her. She had spent so many years believing he had abandoned them, that he'd chosen to disappear. She had hated him, mourned him, missed him, and now she might be seconds from seeing him again. The door opened. A man stepped through, dressed in a gray uniform shirt with a ring of keys clipped to his belt. He was older now, his hair grayer, his frame leaner, but Leanna saw it instantly. The way he walked, the familiar slope of his shoulders, the same eyes that had once watched her learn to ride a bike. Her breath left her body in a single, shaky gust. "Daddy," she whispered. He froze. His gaze settled on her face, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Recognition dawned slowly, like sunlight creeping over the edge of a curtain. His mouth opened, then closed again. "Leanna?" His voice cracked on the name. She nodded, unable to speak. He stepped closer, his hands trembling. "Is it really you?" She nodded again, and before she knew it, she was in his arms, the smell of oil and dust and old paper pressing into her skin. He held her tightly, as if afraid she might vanish if he let go. "I thought you were gone," she said into his shoulder, her voice muffled and raw. "I never left you," he said. "I just had to disappear." They sat together in the maintenance lounge, a cramped room with mismatched chairs and an old soda machine that rattled when it dispensed. Her father made them both instant coffee, his hands still shaking. He looked older than she remembered, with deep lines across his face and weariness in his posture. But his eyes held the same quiet fire. He listened as she told him everything. The clinic, the two girls, the name Noel Harper. When she showed him the photos on her phone, he stared at them with trembling fingers, nodding slowly. "I always feared they'd done something like this," he murmured, "but I never had proof." "You've been looking for them?" she asked. He looked at her then, pain etched into every feature, from the moment they vanished. He told her how he had left not because he wanted to run from them, but because he believed the people who took Naomi and Nora had eyes everywhere, that they were powerful, connected. He had suspected the church, but every attempt to investigate was met with roadblocks, threats, or worse. Friends who tried to help were intimidated into silence. He had received a phone call 2 weeks after the girls went missing. A woman's voice, calm. "Stop asking questions or you'll bury more children." So he vanished, changing his name and taking a janitorial job in the very place that stored records. It was the only way he could get access. Over the years, he collected what he could: fragments of paperwork, copies of adoption filings, names of donors. He kept them in a worn folder hidden beneath the floorboards of his small rented room. That night, Leanna followed him home. The neighborhood was rough, the building old and cracked, but his room was neat. He retrieved the folder from beneath a loose board and laid it on the table. Inside were records, typed and handwritten, names of children, scanned copies of consent forms signed under dubious circumstances, donation logs from church members, lists of children sent to partner families across state lines. Leanna stared at the names, her stomach turning. So many. Her sisters were just 2 among dozens. "They were selling us," she said softly. "Not for profit," he said bitterly. "For pride, for power. They thought they were saving us from ourselves." She flipped to the last page. 2 names circled in red ink: Noel Harper, Abigail Stone. Next to them, a notation in Robert's handwriting, matched through Second Chance Fellowship, approved 2006, adopted by Stephen and Mary Ann Harper. It was all there. Everything. The room was silent for a long moment. Then her father said, "You know what this means." She nodded. "We can expose them." He gave her a small smile, the first she had seen from him in nearly 2 decades. "Then let's finish what we started." As she left his apartment later that night, the folder clutched tightly in her arms, Leanna felt something in her shift. For the first time in 18 years, she didn't feel like a girl lost in the ruins of her childhood. She felt like a woman armed with truth. She walked through the dark streets with fire in her chest and her father's voice in her ears. Find the truth, then show it to the world. The next few days passed in a blur of restless energy and sharpened focus. Leanna moved through her routine like a woman possessed, her mind constantly circling the same 2 names, Noel Harper and Abigail Stone. She returned to the clinic each morning with dark circles under her eyes, her attention drifting whenever conversation turned toward mundane things. She barely slept, lying awake into the early hours with the folder her father had given her open across the kitchen table, pages spread out like pieces of a map she was determined to follow to the end. Her father, Robert, called her each night. They spoke in hushed tones, trading what they found, what they remembered. He had been watching from the shadows for nearly 2 decades, his memory a well of names and connections. With his help, she traced the Harpers, Stephen and Mary Ann, to a quiet suburb in Georgia. Their daughters, Noel and Abigail, had graduated from the same private high school, attended the same university, even participated in the same youth outreach programs under the Harper family's church. They had become a local success story, examples of godly redemption, their faces smiling from yearbooks and press releases. Leanna read those words with a sick taste in her mouth. On a humid Wednesday morning, she boarded a bus to Georgia with a borrowed suitcase and a determined heart. Her father had offered to come with her, but she insisted on going alone. This part, she felt, was hers to face. She needed to see them in person, to know without doubt. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the photograph of the three girls on the porch swing, herself in the middle, Naomi and Nora on either side, their laughter frozen in time. She kept the photo tucked in her wallet like a relic, the last unbroken link to a childhood she had mourned for too long. The town was picturesque in the way that made her stomach turn. Tree-lined streets, brick churches, pristine lawns. The Harper residence sat at the corner of a cul-de-sac, a two-story colonial with hanging flower baskets and a white porch swing eerily similar to the one from Leanna's own childhood. She stood across the street for a long time, watching. A black SUV was parked in the driveway. A wind chime tinkled softly in the breeze. She had timed her visit to coincide with a local panel event advertised on the church's website, Youth Leadership and Redemption, a testimony of sisters. The flyer featured Noel and Abigail's names beneath their smiling faces. The event would be held in the church's multipurpose room, open to the public. Leanna walked into the building just after 6, heart pounding, sweat forming along her spine. She found a seat near the back of the hall, tucked into the last row beside a wall. The room slowly filled with people, parents, parishioners, students. The atmosphere was celebratory, proud. A pastor introduced the girls with great enthusiasm, speaking of grace-driven lives and beautiful outcomes of faith. Then they walked in. Leanna's breath hitched. The two young women on stage looked polished and confident, dressed in conservative dresses with pinned hair and modest heels. But under the layers of presentation, Leanna saw the girls she'd loved, the curve of a cheek, the way Abigail twisted her fingers when nervous, the lilt in Noel's voice when she laughed. She watched them speak. Noel eloquent and poised, Abigail more reserved but no less passionate. They spoke of finding purpose, of being adopted into love, of becoming who they were meant to be. Leanna's nails dug into her palms. After the event, people gathered near the front to shake hands and offer praise. Leanna waited until the crowd began to thin. Then she stepped forward. Noel turned first, smiling warmly. "Hi there. Did you enjoy the panel?" Leanna's mouth was dry. She reached into her purse and pulled out the photograph. Her hands shook as she extended it toward them. "I think we've met before," she said softly. Abigail glanced at the photo, confused. Noel reached out and took it, her eyes scanning the image. A beat, then another, and then something shifted in her face, an almost imperceptible falter in her smile. Her hand trembled slightly as she passed the photo to her sister. Abigail stared. "I believe," Leanna said, her voice low and tight, "that you're my sisters." There was silence, the kind that seemed to slow time, to pull every molecule in the room into stillness. Abigail's eyes darted to Noel. Noel's face tightened. "I think you're mistaken," she said. Her voice remained calm, but her posture stiffened. She stepped back slightly. "No, I'm not," Leanna said. "That's me, and those are you, Naomi and Nora." Abigail flinched at the names. Noel's voice hardened. "I don't know what you want, but this is inappropriate." "I want the truth," Leanna replied. "I want my family back. You need to leave." Security was called. They escorted her out gently but firmly, murmuring apologies. She didn't resist. She walked out into the night air, her chest tight, her heart hammering. Her hands still clutched the photo. She had come so close. Back in her motel room, she lay on the stiff mattress and stared at the ceiling. Her thoughts churned. She had seen something in their eyes. Recognition, even if they didn't want to admit it. She had touched a nerve. She knew it. The next morning, a knock at the door pulled her from sleep. She opened it to find a young woman standing nervously in the hallway. It was Abigail. Leanna let her in wordlessly. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the motel air conditioner. Abigail looked different without the polished presentation. Softer, more uncertain. Her hands trembled in her lap. "I don't remember much," she said quietly. "Bits and pieces, a garden, a swing, someone calling us my little stars." Leanna smiled through the tears that welled in her eyes. "That was Mom. She used to call you that." Abigail looked down. "They told us our birth parents were unstable, that we were abandoned. They lied." Abigail nodded slowly. "I don't know what to believe." Leanna took her hand. "Believe what you feel. You know the truth in your bones." Abigail reached into her purse and pulled out a small box. Inside was a cassette tape, faded and worn. "I found this years ago in a box of old things. I didn't know what it was." Leanna took it, recognizing it instantly. Her father had recorded their voices once, playing around with an old tape recorder. She could still hear their giggles as they recited nursery rhymes. "I want to remember," Abigail said, "but I'm afraid." Leanna nodded. "So was I, for a long time." They sat together in the fading light, two women tied by blood and years of separation, one remembering, the other trying to. That night, Leanna called her father. "She came," she whispered. "She remembers a little." There was a pause. Then Robert's voice, thick with emotion. "Then we're not too late." But Noel didn't come. Not yet. And Leanna knew the battle had only begun. The truth was still buried deep beneath layers of comfort and constructed identity, but a crack had formed. And through it, the light was beginning to shine. Leanna didn't return to Baton Rouge immediately. She extended her stay in Georgia, moving from her motel to a small rented room above a diner near the edge of town. The days were sticky and slow, filled with the kind of southern heat that pressed on the lungs, but her mind stayed sharp, even as her body dragged with exhaustion. She spent her time writing, organizing everything she had collected. Her father's documents, the recordings, the photos, the adoption files he had copied by hand. Abigail had visited her twice more. They spoke carefully, circling the truth like an exposed wound, both aching to touch it and terrified of what it would reveal. Abigail was slowly beginning to accept it, the cracks in her adopted identity growing wider with every page she read from Leanna's folder. But Noel remained silent, unreachable. Leanna called her father each night, giving him updates, talking through plans. Robert was cautious. He had spent years in the shadows, knowing the cost of moving too fast. But Leanna had fire in her now. She had seen her sisters' faces. She had heard their voices. And she would not be patient anymore. On the third day after Abigail's first visit, Leanna received a message from a contact her father had used once, an independent journalist named James Mullen. Robert had mentioned him months earlier as someone who had tried to investigate New Heart Evangelical before being threatened into silence. James had gone underground, writing for small independent platforms, publishing exposés that drew more ire than praise. But now he was ready to listen. They met at a coffee shop on the edge of town, the kind of place with dusty bookshelves and a single barista who didn't look up from his crossword. James was tall, gaunt, with silver-flecked stubble and tired eyes that scanned Leanna with cautious respect. She handed him the folder without preamble. He read in silence for 20 minutes, turning pages with slow, deliberate movements. When he looked up, his expression was grim. "You realize what this is," he said. "I do. If this gets out, it could bring down half the network of private adoptions in 3 states. Churches, judges, politicians." Leanna nodded. "That's the idea." James leaned back, exhaling. "I've seen hints of this before. Families whose kids vanished from the system, birth parents whose signatures were forged, donations funneled through churches into anonymous programs. But no one ever brought me proof like this." "There's more," Leanna said. "My sister, Abigail, she's starting to remember. She has a cassette tape, a recording of us when we were little." "Where is it?" "In a safe place." James closed the folder and met her eyes. "If I run this, it's going to blow up. You need to be ready. I've been ready since I was 15. He nodded slowly. "Give me 2 days." That night, Leanna sat in her room, the ceiling fan rattling above her, and listened to the tape again. She had found a thrift store cassette player and carefully fed the worn plastic into its mouth. The voice that emerged was hers, younger, brighter. Then Naomi's laugh, clear and ringing. Then Nora's soft voice, and near the end their father's voice saying, "My little stars, you're going to shine one day." She cried for the first time in weeks. 2 days later, James published the article under the headline "Sanctified Theft: How New Heart Evangelical Rebranded Child Trafficking as Christian Charity." It hit the internet like a match tossed into dry brush. Social media exploded. Some readers called it lies, others demanded answers. Local and national news outlets picked it up within hours. A spokesperson for New Heart issued a short statement calling the article "dangerous misinformation." But it was too late. The documents had been published: names, signatures, dates, a photograph of Leanna, Naomi, and Nora as children, screenshots of adoption files, audio clips of the cassette, testimony from Leanna and Robert, and, under the condition of anonymity, a statement from Abigail. Leanna knew the blowback would come fast, and it did. The next morning, she found her car's windshield smashed in the motel parking lot. A handwritten note had been left under the wiper blade. "Stop or lose what you've got left." She didn't call the police. She knew better. Instead, she called her father and warned Abigail to be careful. That evening, she went for a walk to clear her head. As she rounded the corner near the diner, a man in a dark hoodie stepped into her path. She stopped short. His voice was calm and deliberate. "You've made a mess." Leanna didn't move. "You should have left well enough alone." She stared at him. "Who are you?" "Doesn't matter. What matters is this. Stop digging, stop talking, take your kids and go back to your little city. Because the people behind this, they don't forgive, and they don't forget." She kept her voice steady. "You're threatening a mother." "I'm warning a mother." He turned and walked away. Leanna stood there until her knees stopped shaking. The next morning, her father called her. He had found something new. A woman, an elderly former administrator from the Second Chance Fellowship, had reached out to him through a mutual acquaintance. Her name was Lorraine Becker. She had worked for the church for 30 years, managing paperwork, facilitating placements, overseeing logistics, and she was dying. Terminal cancer, with only a few months left to live. She had read the article, and she was ready to confess. Leanna and Robert arranged to meet her at a hospice facility 2 hours away. Abigail insisted on coming. Lorraine was thin and pale, her voice faint but steady. She didn't want sympathy. She wanted to clear her conscience. "I helped make it happen," she said, her eyes staring past them. "I processed the paperwork. I changed the names. I made sure the birth records disappeared. And I kept quiet while they called it God's work." "Why?" Leanna asked. Lorraine's gaze flicked to her. "Because I believed them. At first, they said the children were being saved, that the families they came from were broken, dangerous, and maybe some were, but not all, not yours." She told them about the files stored in the church's private archives, originals, untouched by digital sanitizing, documents signed under pressure, agreements forged, letters from parents who begged for their children back and never got answers. She gave them an address, a key, a warning. "They won't let you take it," she said. "If they catch you inside, they'll bury it, just like they buried the others." Leanna held her hand before they left. "You did the right thing." Lorraine's eyes welled with tears. Too late. The following night, under cover of darkness, Leanna and Abigail drove to the church campus. Robert stayed behind as lookout, parked down the street with a pair of binoculars and a police scanner. The door Lorraine's key unlocked led to a basement storage room. It smelled of dust and mold, the air thick with silence. Using flashlights, they moved quickly through shelves and filing cabinets, looking for the folders Lorraine had described. They found them in a locked cabinet in the back, thick manila envelopes labeled with codes and years. Leanna opened one and gasped. Inside were original intake forms, photographs of children, medical histories, behavioral reports, and letters from social workers. One folder held the complete adoption file for Naomi and Nora James. Handwritten notes along the margins. A stamped approval from a local judge. A forged signature from Devorah James. Abigail stared at the file, her hands trembling. "They stole us," she whispered. Leanna nodded, and called it a blessing. Before they could leave, footsteps echoed upstairs, then voices. They froze, hearts racing. Leanna extinguished the flashlight and pulled Abigail behind a row of shelves. They crouched low, barely breathing, as the door creaked open. 2 men entered, their flashlight beams sweeping the room. "Becker's keys missing," one of them said. "If anyone gets into these files, it's over." The other cursed under his breath. "We should have shredded them years ago." They moved toward the cabinet. Leanna grabbed Abigail's hand and motioned silently. They crawled around the opposite side, slipping behind a stack of boxes, hearts pounding. When the men moved deeper into the room, Leanna nudged Abigail toward the stairs. They crept up silently, every step agonizing. At the top, they slipped through the door and ran. They didn't stop until they reached Robert's car. Back at their motel, Leanna made copies of every document. Digital scans, photographs, backups. She mailed a copy to James, sent another to a legal contact in New Orleans. Then she sat on the edge of her bed and exhaled. They had the truth now. Proof, names, evidence. But what they didn't have, what still ached like an open wound, was Noel. And the people who had built this empire of stolen children were still out there, watching, waiting. But for the first time, Leanna wasn't afraid. She was ready. Leanna had always imagined that justice, if it ever came, would feel like a thunderclap, a roaring moment of triumph that would drown out years of pain. But as the news of the exposé spread and the days grew heavier with tension, she learned instead that truth, once freed, brought with it an eerie silence, the kind that settled into your bones and sat behind your eyes. It was not relief that filled her, but a bone-deep weariness, like someone who had spent too many years climbing and now stood at the top only to realize the climb was not over. The storm hadn't broken. It had only shifted. 3 days after the break-in at New Heart Evangelical's archive room, her father called and told her he wasn't feeling well. The phone line crackled, but his voice was clear, steady as always. Still, something in the way he said her name gave her pause. "Are you okay?" she asked, instinctively sitting up straighter in the chair by her motel window. "I'm just tired," he replied. "Tired in a way that doesn't sleep off." She knew what he meant before he even said it. He had mentioned pain once or twice, the kind that came at night and lingered into morning. But Robert James had always been a man who held his body like a fortress, strong, weathered, defiant. That he was finally admitting fatigue now meant something deeper had taken hold. "I need to see you," she said. "You've got bigger things to do." "You're my father," she replied. "That's the biggest thing I've got." By dusk, she was on the road back to Baton Rouge, leaving Abigail in the care of a trusted friend and carrying the copies of the church documents in a locked satchel across her lap. The folder had become a kind of talisman, heavy and sacred. But that night, for the first time, it felt more like a burden. She wasn't sure if she was carrying it toward victory or simply carrying the weight of her family's ruin. Robert looked older than she remembered when she arrived at his apartment. His skin was grayer, his movements slower. But when she knelt beside him and took his hand, his grip was still strong. "I'm glad you came," he said softly. She sat with him through the night, making tea and fluffing pillows, telling him everything that had happened in the days since they last spoke. How the article had been picked up by national outlets. How 3 families had come forward with eerily similar stories. How a class action lawsuit was being drafted. Robert nodded, absorbing every detail, pride flickering behind tired eyes. "I thought we'd never get here," he whispered. "We're not there yet," she replied. "No, but we can see it." The next morning, Leanna received a call from Lorraine Becker's attorney. Lorraine had died peacefully in her sleep just hours after they left her side. The timing sent a chill down Leanna's spine. It was as if the confession had been her final breath. She didn't cry. She couldn't. There wasn't space in her chest for mourning anymore. Only forward. Only next. Later that afternoon, a woman appeared at her father's apartment. She was in her late 60s, with trembling hands and a face lined with sorrow. Her name was Judith, and she had once worked as an assistant in the judge's office that approved dozens of New Hearts adoptions. "I was young," she said as Leanna poured her tea. "I didn't know what I was a part of, not fully, but I remember things. And now, with what you've published, I thought, maybe it's time." She brought with her a box of old memos and handwritten meeting notes, some dated almost 2 decades back. Among them was a folded letter. Leanna opened it slowly, her breath catching as she read the words. It was from her mother. A letter Devorah James had written weeks after Naomi and Nora disappeared. It was addressed to the Board of Fellowship Oversight, and it was angry, raw, pleading. She had written of being followed, of being told her children were gone for their own good. She had begged for answers, for help. Leanna's hands trembled as she held it. her mother's voice alive on the page, fighting even as she was silenced. Judith lowered her head. They kept everything, even the pain. The next few days unfolded in snapshots. A break-in news alert that a senior member of New Heart had resigned suddenly. A voicemail from Abigail saying she had dreamed of a swing and the smell of their old backyard garden. A message from James Mullen that federal investigators had requested access to the files she'd given him, and then, inevitably, the silence. Noel. There had still been no word, no phone call, no message. Abigail had tried gently several times, but Noel remained unreachable. Until the morning, Leanna received an envelope. It was unmarked, slid under the door of her motel room while she slept. Inside was a single photograph, 3 little girls on a porch swing, and on the back, in careful handwriting, "You remember more than you think." No signature, no return address. She stared at the card for a long time. It was her photograph, but this copy was faded differently, worn in another way. Noel had kept one all these years. She had carried it, somewhere, quietly. It was enough to make Leanna believe that her sister hadn't forgotten, just buried it deep. But there was no time to process the hope blooming in her chest. That evening, Robert's condition worsened. His breathing grew shallow, his speech slurred. Leanna called an ambulance, and he was admitted with acute cardiac complications. In the hospital room, as monitors beeped and machines hissed, Leanna sat by his bedside, her fingers curled around his. His eyes fluttered open only once. "You found them," he whispered. "I found them. And you told the world." "I did." He smiled faintly. "Then it was worth everything." That night, Robert James died. The grief didn't come as a wave. It came as a collapse, a quiet implosion that left her hollow. Leanna stayed in the room for hours after they covered his body, the lights dim, the sound of her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. She hadn't just lost a father. She had lost her compass. The funeral was quiet. Abigail came. Judith came. Even James Mullen appeared, standing quietly at the back with a folded newspaper under his arm. They buried Robert in the old South Grove Cemetery, next to a headstone carved for Devora years earlier. For a long time after everyone left, Leanna stood alone between the graves of the 2 people who had built her and broken her in equal measure. Later that night, as she returned to the motel, she found someone waiting outside her room. It was Noel. She stood in jeans and a plain gray sweater, her hair down, her face bare of makeup. She looked tired, fragile, human. Leanna didn't speak. She opened the door and stepped inside, leaving it open behind her. Noel followed. Inside, they sat across from each other at the small motel table. Noel's hands were folded tightly in her lap. "I've read everything," she said. "All of it." Leanna watched her, cautious. "It broke something in me," Noel continued. "Something I thought was real. But now, I don't know what's true." "It's all true," Leanna said gently. "I believe you," Noel whispered. "But believing it doesn't undo what they built in me. I don't know who I am without them. You're my sister. I don't remember that. You don't have to. I do, and I'll remember enough for both of us until you can." Noel's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry." Leanna reached across the table and took her hand. "You don't have to be. You just have to stay." And Noel stayed. That night, the 3 sisters sat together for the first time in 18 years. The conversation was stilted, cautious, broken in places, but it was real, and it was theirs. The truth had come at a cost, but it had come, and they were still standing. The first days after Noel's return passed not with celebration but with quietness. like the hush that settles over a battlefield after the smoke has lifted and the echoes of gunfire fade into memory. There was no grand reunion, no dramatic declarations of sisterhood restored. Instead, there were cautious conversations over lukewarm coffee, tentative exchanges of half-formed memories, and the slow, painstaking weaving of fragile threads between three women who had lived too long in the absence of one another. Noel stayed in Leanna's small apartment, curled on the couch most nights with a blanket pulled high, often silent but present. She listened more than she spoke, her eyes following Abigail's every word, watching the rhythm of her voice, the pattern of her speech, like someone studying a language they once knew but had long forgotten. Leanna didn't push. She cooked meals that went uneaten, offered space when silence was needed, and gently brought up stories from childhood not as reminders, but as offerings, tokens of a past Noel was only beginning to acknowledge as her own. Abigail, though quieter than Leanna, had changed. The uncertainty that had clouded her when they first met had given way to something steadier, more grounded. She moved through the space with care, as if acutely aware of the weight of every gesture, the consequence of every word. She sat with Noel often, sometimes in silence, sometimes speaking softly about fragments of dreams or sensations she couldn't explain. The sound of their mother's humming, the smell of gardenias, the feeling of small hands being held too tightly by strangers in unfamiliar clothes. They were building something, slowly, clumsily, but together. The media storm around New Heart Evangelical and its vast network had only grown. Investigations had been opened in 3 states. Several church leaders had resigned or gone into hiding. Arrests were rumored. Donors were distancing themselves. And a wave of other families, black families, had begun to come forward with eerily similar stories. Children taken, adoption papers falsified, consent manipulated or never obtained. Leanna watched it unfold from a distance, speaking to lawyers when needed, sharing documents with advocacy groups, giving interviews when she felt strong enough, but her focus had narrowed. Justice mattered, yes, but healing was personal, and hers was here, in this small apartment filled with the ghosts of what had been stolen and what was slowly being restored. Then, one afternoon, a package arrived. It bore no return address, but the handwriting on the label was precise, familiar in a way that made Leanna's stomach twist before she even opened it. Inside was a plain manila envelope containing a single letter and an old photograph. The letter was typed. The message was short. You think you've won, but we were never after the truth, only control. The moment people forget your story, we begin again. And they will forget. They always do. The photo beneath was grainy, faded by time, showing a group of children lined up outside what looked like a community center. Leanna's eyes moved quickly across the image until she froze. In the second row, a little girl stood, black, small, no older than 6, with a name tag that read Charlene. Her face was turned slightly, but Leanna saw the same hollowness she remembered in the mirror during her own childhood. The bottom of the photo had a handwritten year, 2019. The message was clear. The operation had roots deeper than anyone imagined. Even as one branch was exposed, others continued elsewhere, hidden in plain sight. The enemy wasn't just a church or a few corrupt officials. It was an idea, a system, a machinery of belief that wrapped theft in Scripture and called it salvation. Leanna showed the letter to Abigail and Noel that evening. They read it silently. Noel's jaw tightened, and Abigail's eyes welled with unshed tears. "What do we do?" Abigail asked quietly. "We fight smarter, Leanna said, louder and together. In the weeks that followed, they moved with new purpose. Noel began speaking to reporters, carefully at first, her voice trembling, but gaining strength with every interview. She recounted her memories, her confusion, her grief. Abigail joined her, and their story, three sisters torn apart and reunited by truth, spread further, capturing attention beyond headlines. Not because it was rare, but because it wasn't. They became the face of a movement they had never asked for, but refused to walk away from. Leanna returned to Baton Rouge and transformed her father's small apartment into an office space. She worked with local advocates and national watchdogs. She created a database where families could submit suspicious adoption records, share testimony, or find legal assistance. She gave lectures in churches and community centers, not to accuse, but to awaken. She told her mother's story, her father's, her own, and people listened. One morning, months later, the three sisters stood in front of the old house where they had once lived. It had fallen into disrepair since their parents' deaths, paint peeling, porch sagging, the garden long overgrown, but it was still standing. Like them. They had come with a purpose. Noel carried a small metal box in her hands, weathered but carefully preserved. Inside were photographs, letters, and a copy of their mother's unsent plea to the church. On the edge of the backyard, beneath the crooked branches of a magnolia tree, Leanna knelt and began to dig. The soil was soft, rich with memory. They buried the box together, not as a farewell, but as a promise. That they would never let anyone rewrite their story again. That they would not forget. That they would not let others forget. As they stood, brushing soil from their hands, Noel looked up at the sky, her eyes bright against the morning light. "I remember something else," she said. Leanna turned. "Mom used to sing when she cooked. This one song, over and over. I can't remember the words, just the way it felt. Like being safe." Leanna nodded, her voice barely a whisper. She used to sing it to us at night, called us her little stars. Noel smiled. That night, back at Leanna's apartment, they sat in the living room together, wrapped in the soft comfort of shared silence. Abigail leaned against Noel, half asleep. Leanna sipped tea, her mind drifting. Outside the window, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm. Cars passed. Voices rose and fell. Life continued. But inside, something new had taken root. They had returned, not just to each other, but to themselves. And they were not going anywhere. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Watch our other videos for more powerful, true-inspired stories. And if you believe this message matters, share this video with someone who needs to see it.